So people likened unidentified in the air to, sailing vessels. They had no other term of reference that they could actually use for it, other than saying orbs or whatever. You have to remember, in those days, people didn't know anything about meteors or meteorites or any of that sort of thing. And it was basically thought by science, even back then, that these things, when they hit the ground, if they were hot, that it actually was just a rock that had been struck by lightning or something like that, a meteor, or a meteorite. And it wasn't until the latter part of the 1800s that people started taking these things seriously as coming in from the sky. I'm talking about meteors now. But as we know now, you mentioned Kenneth Arnold.
Yeah.
He's the one that sort of got the ball rolling unintentionally about this, sighting over the Cascade Mountains, Mount Rainier,
right.
Mount Rainier,
mm-hmm.
and in Washington State. And for some reason, there had been many reports before that, particularly during the Second World War, amongst the Allied forces and the German forces and the Japanese. Everybody saw these things, and but not very well cataloged, and because everybody thought they were secret aircraft of the other side, and so they weren't, they didn't bring it out into the press or anything like that. So when Ken Arnold came along in '47, an experienced pilot, he had 3,500 hours of flying time. He was flying a little light airplane, no radio or anything in it, flying through the mountains, which is a hairy occupation nonetheless. And
yeah.
He was a salesman selling fire suppression equipment.
Wasn't it like a little Cessna he was flying through there?
It was called a Call-Air 2A.
Right.
It was a low-wing airplane with what we call reverse struts on it. That means the struts come from the shoulder of the aircraft down to the wings.
Okay.
But it was a very effective little airplane, and it eventually evolved into a crop duster, and for later years, a Call-Air 9. But the little airplane itself, on relatively low horsepower, cruise along at about 100 to 110 miles an hour. But the instruments he had to work with were fairly primitive compared to what we have nowadays. No navigation equipment other than the chart he might have, and a compass and a stopwatch, or the clock on the panel. So he saw these things passing through the mountains from Mount Rainier down to Mount Washington, and Mount Adams really, and then over towards Mount Washington. And he clocked them, and when he clocked them, the speed he initially came up with was about 1,700 miles an hour. And, so to be even more conservative, he knocked that down to 1,200. And 1,200 miles an hour in 1947 was unheard of unless it was a V2 rocket.
Right. And
there were 9 of these things, and the Chuck Yeager didn't even break the sound barrier on the Bell X-1 until October of that year. So his sighting was in June, and so like 3-4 months later, or 4 or 5 months later, Chuck Yeager finally broke the sound barrier, and that's at 700 miles an hour. So that's how that was a rocket-powered airplane too.
Right.
So this, there was nothing that we had that could do that kind of those kinds of speeds. On a horizontal flight plane. V2 rockets, you wouldn't fire 9 of those off and have them flying horizontally. That's an impossibility. If you ever hear that theory, it's insane. It's a stupid theory. We know now that, judging from the way he saw them, the mountain tips, the mountain outcroppings that he saw flying behind, and his distance when he saw them, which was about 21 miles away from Mount Rainier, precludes these from being anything like birds closer to make them look like they were going faster, because they couldn't have been, because they were flying behind mountain outcroppings that were 21 miles away.
Yeah.
And any number of other silly theories that have come up over the years. But anyway, so his still stands. But what happened was, when he went to, he eventually landed in, he was taking off from Chehalis in Washington State, crossed over spent about half an hour looking around the mountains there, because there was a missing air transport, military transport plane. And people used to keep an eye out for it. There was a reward for it, as a matter of fact, of $5,000, which was a lot of money back in 1947. So he had a peek around there, and then he continued on to Yakima in Idaho. And so after that was over, when he landed there, he mentioned to a pilot friend of his, who was actually a helicopter pilot, they had him back then, new ones, relatively new in that time, and what he'd seen, and then he left. Bear in mind now, when he was over Mount Radio, he couldn't report this as on the radio because he didn't have one. He didn't have electrics in the airplane, and so we took off from Yakima and went to Pendleton, where he lived in Idaho, and when he got there was reporters waiting for him because this pilot friend of his had told some people or called the press or something like that, so they were waiting for him when he got there. So for some reason, this thing just caught on within about a day or so. It started going around all over the United States, into Canada, and then over in Europe, in Associated Press, and the international press resources, and it just picked up. And from there on in, people started reporting them publicly, which they never did before. And they were there. There are reports. We've got, reports the same as we read today, back, in the 30s and the 20s, people driving along in their car, and all of a sudden the engine stops, and then they get out to see what's going on. Next thing you know, got this thing camped over top of them. And they're, standing there awestruck, trying to figure out what it is. The thing leaves, and then the car starts up again,
Yeah, classic.
It goes right back into the, the early years, what they call airship reports from 1896 and 1897 in Canada, in the United States and Canada. And but anyway, there's actually one over Halifax, too, in 1897.
Yeah.
And originally thought to have been some Arctic explorer who perished up in the north. He never did get down here, but people were speculating maybe that's what it was. And you have to understand, in 1897, airships, it was a long, it took another 7 or 8 or 10 years before dirigibles got to be even anywhere near effective,
Yeah.
And the brightly lit, shining lights, well, you'd have to carry a generator back around the turn of from the 18th to 19th, into the 20th century, around the turn of the century. These things weighed a huge amount. They didn't have alternators back then. They were generators, and they were very heavy to generate enough power to supply light to an arc light.
Yeah, I find people, too, of certain eras seem to conceptualize with the technology that they're acclimatized to seeing. So a lot of these sightings throughout the years and decades seem to represent what they're accustomed to seeing.
Well, they take Jules Verne.
Yeah.
His, Master of the World and that sort of thing, on the airships he had in there. So he postulated, and people would run with that. Well, say, well, maybe that's what this was. But there was an awful lot of them. And they're still unexplained to this day. So,
yeah,
including up over Ottawa, the Houses of Parliament. They actually shut Parliament down there one day because they thought it was some kind of an enemy threat. They didn't know who the enemy was, but they thought it might be.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
When was that?
This would be back in 1897.
Wow.
Now, some of that stuff I wasn't aware of when I wrote my book. But then again, if I was aware of it, if it was up around Ottawa, I wouldn't have mentioned it anyway because I was pertaining to Maritimes, So
exactly.
So then again, I just moved on into whatever I could find within a matter of days of Ken Arnold sighting. Day and a half, actually, there was a sighting over in PEI. And
really?
The normal type of sighting, some farmer saw this thing zipping across the sky, And, of course, back in Prince Edward Island, back in 1947, you had Summerside Air Force Base there. And, of course, that went on for many years. It was phased out, I believe, in the early 80s sometime, but maybe a little later than that. We had many bases down here, Chatham Basin, New Brunswick. We had still at Greenwood and Shearwater, and down in Cape Breton, radar base down there, and so on. And so even during the war, DeBert and even Stanley Airfield, they were all military, training facilities and so on. But anyway, so we had, particularly up north in Newfoundland, Labrador, because of the Lend-Lease Act between Great Britain and the United States, for the 50 overage destroyers, they accepted some land up in Labrador and Newfoundland to build Air Force bases up there. And the United States Air Force did, because don't forget, back during the Second World War, Newfoundland and the Labrador territories were still English, owned by the English, really, or by the British. They never came in until 1949, so it's part of Canada. So they had all of these military bases up there and SAC bases and everything during the early 50s, right up into the 60s. And there's, well, Goose Bay is still there and so on, but it's in Canadian owned now. But there were many sightings, by pilots in the Air Force up there. Some really particularly interesting internationally known ones that occurred up there. So I did manage to get the documents on those. That's what's really interesting about the Canadian sightings too. A lot of them are either RCMP documents or the military documents, which is a particular document that pertains specifically to unidentified flying objects. And let's always keep in mind that UFO means unidentified flying objects. I find it quite often these days that when it's referred to by other people who write about it, particularly the press, that people they didn't know what it was, and so some people are speculating that it might have been a UFO.
Yeah.
You don't know what it was, that's exactly what it was, an unidentified flying object. If it was in the air flying, you don't know what it is. That's all that means, Doesn't mean alien spacecraft or anything,
Mm-hmm.
But it's got that connotation to it now, so
yeah.
Those initials, so.
I have a question here, kind of off topic a little bit, but on the same grain here, same vein. We're at a very different time. It feels, to me, now in 2010, we're starting to expand our mind a little bit and spread that knowledge more. We're having a lot more grassroots movements. We're talking to our neighbors like we used to do back in the early 50s. There seemed to be a period where we all kind of shut ourselves off, and we're also in a time of environmental upheaval. Loss of trust in the government, and for a long time people have been waiting for the government to say, hey, unidentified flying objects are of interesting concern, like a disclosure of some kind. But I think many people are starting to realize that, we don't have to wait for the government or any kind of special interest group to say, yeah, these things are here, because they're obviously here. There's a lot of stuff going on. There are a lot of sightings from credible witnesses, credible people of high rank, military, government, and otherwise. Do you think that disclosure will come, or do you think this is something that's going to unravel itself from the ground up, from the people out, Like this, the implications of what's going on here is the biggest story in the history of civilization. And these peddlers seem to be poo-pooing in a subject that is incredibly important. Do you think that these puppets are going to will come out at some point and say, this is happening?
Yeah, but
because it is happening, it's obvious. But I mean, for them to make an official record. Yeah,
I think they're going to have their hands forced, as they say. Force the hand of government to do this. And I'm not entirely uncertain as to whether maybe this is what's happening. What the psyche behind all of this is, I don't know. There's this big controversy about extraterrestrial hypothesis, about whether these things are actually from some other planet, and you have to shoot down that silly point-to-point theory. That's not how it would have worked. Supposing this has been going on for the last, I don't know, but there's evidence of this, in archaeological drawings on rocks, and so on, that archaeologists have found. Indicating the same little lens-shaped things, flying around the sky, and little creatures and so on.
Exactly.
Going back thousands of years,
That's right.
In Egypt, and rocks down in Australia, and then in China, and
It boggles my mind how these people find the courage to deny the amount of evidence to support the idea that we have been visited and are being visited. The implications that I see are of national security in the way that, they don't have control over the skies.
Well, they don't. I say that all the time. That's the big embarrassment, you see.
That's right. But my problem is this. We're at a point now where we're willing to accept the idea of life in the universe, and the Pope in the Vatican, for God's sakes, said, you know what, it's possible. They're just an extension of God. Our space brothers. It's obvious there's something going on here. People are tired of this. I don't even know how long they can keep the charade up, because it's like they're blatantly lying. They've been covering up the biggest story of our time from the beginning.
Well,
it bothers me.
I think they probably have reason to do so. Not as much nowadays as they did back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Back in the 1960s, United States Air Force